Autumn is one of my favorite times of the year. Today's dominant color is yellow, channeling all of that autumn energy. So if you want to paint right along with me, grab your paper and paints. Let's get into it. We're trying out another new journal today. This is the Etcher Lab Etcher Sketchbook cold pressed watercolor paper, size A5. So I'm really excited to do my first painting in here. If you decide to follow along with today's project, you're going to need some drawing gum and your watercolor paints. This is an autumn themed tutorial. We're going to be painting a fall scene inspired by this image on Unsplash. You can download that free in the description below. Now with the hardcover here, I'm going to need a clip or something to help hold that down. I'm actually just going to take my bar of soap here since I'm going to need that later for my masking fluid, and that's going to weigh it down on that side. And I love to mask out the edges on watercolor journals because it creates pretty borders. So I'm going to take this 1/4 inch Blick painter's tape and mask out the edges. This will ensure some really pretty borders. It helps the final painting almost look like it has a frame around it. You can even wrap that around a few of the pages underneath to help hold the paper down. I'm only using one brush today, and you might be shocked at how large it is. This is a Princeton Aqua Elite size 12 long round brush, and I'm purposely trying to use a bigger brush than I'm comfortable with, and that's to help my style be a little bit looser and more painterly on this particular painting. Colors you'll need a warm yellow. I'm going to be using Holbein Gamboge Nova, Daniel Smith Burnt Sienna, and Daniel Smith Ultramarine Blue, all primary colors. Since I'm going to be using a lot of my warm yellow, that's going to be the main color in this image, I want to make sure I have some fresh, juicy paint squeezed out on my palette and ready to go. I also have a rag for blotting, a water jar, and an extra one for rinsing. And we aren't going to need to do much in terms of sketching. That said, I do want to put a couple of marks down just to indicate where my main compositional focus will be. There are a couple of trees I want to sketch. So I'm having a couple of these tree branches extend almost to the center of the painting, and there's going to be these large clumps of yellow leaves. And as I mentioned, you're going to want to have some masking fluid on hand to help protect the white of the paper for that dappled light in between trees. And I want to make these curvy trees like you see in the image. They have this really cool, eerie forest look to them. Very moody. So I'm drawing these curvy branch shapes and trunks, following fairly closely actually the feel and the characteristic of these trees in the reference image. But of course you can add your own branches and shapes and really make the drawing whatever you want it to be. So that's a start, and then over here there's one prominent tree trunk, but that's something that we can always paint on later. We don't really have to sketch that. I think the most important thing starting out is to indicate where your white shape is going to be, where the sky is showing, and maybe a couple of fallen trees if that's something you want to include. Always makes the forest look a little more real, but very, very lightly sketching. Okay, so the next step is to take masking fluid. We want to use this to protect some of the pure white of the paper. This is Pebeo drawing gum. I like that it's blue because it's easier to see where I need to remove it after it's dry. And this is just a cheap brush. It's just a craft brush from the craft store. I'm going to dip it in water and then swipe that on my soap. So I have a bar of soap over here. This just helps protect the bristles and make it easier to clean them up afterwards. And then I'm going to grab some masking fluid and start to dot in some shapes around the trees here where I want to ensure that I'm preserving the white of the paper. Mostly it's really important to have a couple of these dots where the trees get really thick because we want to be able to paint freely over those thick trees with our yellow paint and not worry about preserving all these whites. So this is a way to paint really pure watercolor, transparent watercolor, without having to do any kind of lifting or anything like that, and just preserving the white of the paper. Now, as far as the center of the painting, where the sun is really bright, I am just going to be using negative painting, wet on wet, around that area. So I'm not going to concern myself too much with that. But over here, I'm slowing down and just making sure I have some white protected with masking fluid, particularly between the trees here. So you're going to take your masking fluid and just dollop it on wherever you want to protect your whites. Over here where we have this dense area of branches, I want to have a couple of luminous spots where the sunlight is peeking through. So how you design your whites is really up to you. You almost have to think inversely, thinking ahead about where the whites are going to be. This is tricky for beginning watercolor artists because most of the time we're used to working dark to light and we put our highlights in at the end, especially if we work with opaque media. But watercolor, you really have to think backwards, thinking about planning ahead for your whites and building your way light to dark slowly. All right, so we've got some spackling of white here, protected with the masking fluid. Now for the rest of that area, I'm just going to use wet on wet with the yellow coming close to that. But we need to let our masking fluid dry all the way. Make sure to rinse your brush right away. All right, with your masking fluid completely dry, it's time to start painting. We're going to use the wet on wet technique, as I said before, to get some color down, and I'm just going to cover the entire thing in yellow. It's going to be a lot of fun. So if you want to speed up the process of wetting your paper, you can take a spray bottle. Makes it a little bit easier. And then just take your brush and smooth that all out. And this etcher paper is just wonderful. It's really great paper. So you want a glossy surface, no puddling. Should be soaking in slightly, ready to take some paint and make some fuzz. So the wet and wet technique is how we create soft edges. And I want it to look like the yellow leaves are just fading out as the sunlight is shining through. And so I'm going to create almost a vignette with my yellow, representing our beautiful tree branches. Going in quite thick. My paint is really creamy on my brush. And especially concentrating here towards the center while it's still wet. That's where I want the softest, most fuzzy edges. Being a little more careful in the center, not to cover up everything here. Want to leave some brilliant sun shining through. It's okay to cover up where those trees are. Remember to keep in mind that your reference photo is just that. It's a reference. It's not something you want to copy meticulously. I don't think that always makes for the best paintings. But of course, that's my opinion. If you want to copy the photo as close as you can, by all means, go for it. That brings you joy. So we're just taking that gamboge nova all the way down to the bottom of the painting. Here, it's already started to dry a little bit, so I have to dip my tip of my brush in the water to get it flowing a little smoother across the paper. If it starts to catch on the paper, that's a good indicator that paper's a little too dry, your brush is a little too dry, and you need a little more water. Isn't that already pretty? It already looks like fall. All we've done is one color. How fun is that? All right, to begin intensifying things, we're going to start mixing in burnt sienna. My burnt sienna is a little dirty, so I'm going to have to kind of scrub at it to release some of the paint. And now I'm going to begin dropping that in while my gamboge nova is still wet at the bottom here. I want my foreground to look quite dark. You can even mix in a more intense version of your yellow. So this is where all of those fallen leaves are going to be represented. I'm working really fast, quite loosely, using quick, expressive brush strokes. As we get to the center of the painting, I'm using more upstrokes to represent trees. So your brush is your ultimate tool for achieving any effect you can imagine. Let's mix in a little more yellow. Over here where we've got some specific tree trunk shapes, I want to slow down a little bit. Just make sure I get those indicated correctly. And make sure that your tree trunk shapes are not all spread evenly across the page. We don't want patterning to happen. That tends to look formulaic and unrealistic. Asymmetry in nature is more commonly what you'll see. So now I'm beginning to increase the depth, the darkness of this vignette with the burnt sienna gamboge combination. Now as I begin to approach the center a little bit more, I'm using less intense paint, more Gamboge Nova, less burnt sienna, and my paper's already begun to dry now. So everything I'm putting down is staying in place a little bit more. It's not spreading out, softening quite as much as it was at the beginning, which is good. At this point, I'm beginning to add some tree branches, some shapes overlapping that sky area, still sticking with my yellow. And painting these specific trunk shapes. I want to try to think in terms of masses rather than individual leaves. So I'm using the angle of my brush, not the tip. Holding it at a slight angle. We don't really need teeny tiny little brush strokes to achieve a beautiful effect here. I need to pull some more color up in here, and being careful not to cover all of that underpainting, that initial layer of yellow. Still want some of that to shine through. It's pretty simple, mostly just yellow, a little bit of burnt sienna so far, and we're just making blobby tree shapes with a soft vignette of glowing sky in the center. All right, I'm going to rinse that out. We've reached the danger zone. This is the point where it's beginning to look matte dry. So any paint I put down right now, I might run the risk of lifting up those layers underneath. So I'm going to let it dry all the way, and then we'll come back at it with another layer. If you're enjoying this quick seasonal tutorial, you're going to love my Watercolor Mastery membership. Included in the membership are the daily challenges, which are 20 to 30-minute tutorials just like this one. And the best part is they're released every single weekday for an entire calendar year. That's 260 tutorials. There's a huge variety of subject matter: portraits, landscapes, food, flowers, you name it, we've got it. If you want to learn more, there's a link in the description. Let's get back to the video. Okay, my surface has dried enough that I can continue on with another layer. So far we haven't used any of our ultramarine blue, but we need that to create our darkest darks for the foreground. So a great way to create depth in your watercolor painting is to think about your darkest darks being closer to you and in the foreground, and everything that's in the distance fading off a little bit lighter in value. And that's going to be true in this image. It's not true of every painting, but for this one, that's definitely true. I really love this color, especially in combination with burnt sienna. It's one of my favorite color combos. I'm scooping up a creamy mix on my brush and just double checking the wetness level of my painting. Looks like it's totally dry. So now I'm mixing ultramarine and burnt sienna to create more of a neutral chocolate brown. And I'm going to use this to really darken up my tree trunk shapes here. Now when you create lines for trees, try not to make them complete solid lines. Notice how there's a little bit of a gap in between some of my brush strokes. That's helping it look more painterly, calligraphic, loose, and not quite so stifled. So, paint your trees quickly and loosely. Don't worry about and fixate on too many details. You want to just get an idea across, a feeling. A good painting, whether or not it's representational or abstract, whatever the style, will elicit some kind of response in the viewer, an emotional response, and that's a good sign. So if you're already starting to feel something with the colors and with the design of the painting, that means you're headed in the right direction. I'm dropping in a little bit more burnt sienna to darken up the tops of my trees here. Don't want to encroach too much in the area of light, but just a little bit. Adding some more crisscrossing branches. Notice that I've lightened up the value of the color on my brush as I approach that area in light. I'm not using that strong dark anymore. And then for this tree, I'm going to try to leave a strip of that yellow on the left side to help it appear as if there is light shining on that left side. And then as we slide down the trunk of the tree, this area, it looks like it's still a little bit damp on my paper, but that's okay. So it's softening out slightly. And then to help the tree stand out a little bit more so that it appears that there's a light side and a dark side, I need to darken just behind the front of that tree. And so I'm negative painting around that soft edge. And now I'm going to paint some scumbly little tree shapes, just using almost the flattened tip of the brush to create texture and interest. Let's go over to the left side again and do some more specific work on this tree here. Once again, burnt sienna, mostly burnt sienna, with a little of ultramarine mixed in to darken it. And again, we're going to use quick calligraphic upstrokes of the brush to quickly paint tree trunks and branches. And this long, fine tip of this brush, yes, it's a big brush, but it is capable of these teeny tiny little lines. It's quite marvelous. Love me a good round brush. Best tool. I need to lighten my values again as I have some branches coming in front of the light. And again, I don't want to make my lines too connected, too specific. I'm going to take a little bit of, oops, that's too watery, bright yellow, and paint one more blob of a branch shape here. I kind of want there to be a visible stopping point where the yellow hits the tape line up here, so I'm just touching some color right up to the tape. That's going to help with that. Okay, more Gamboge Nova on my brush now. For another layer, more specific tree shapes coming in front of the light. Again, I'm just using a loose, dabby motion of the brush, avoiding some of the underpainting, and adding another layer of yellow across this beautifully golden foliage. Doesn't have to be too specific. In fact, it really shouldn't be. Try to keep it loose and expressive. This is all of these tree branches lit up by the sun in the back of the forest. All right, so now we need to get dark as we approach the foreground. And I want to create some of that impression of fallen leaves on the ground. So I'm taking burnt sienna, ultramarine. This time, very creamy, thick paint. Fairly even mix of the two colors. And we're going to darken up our foreground, especially in the corners. Now's your opportunity to negative paint around some things like fallen trees, if that's what you'd like to do. And again, try not to be too specific with your shapes. If your tree, branch, or trunk on the ground is a little too dark, just take a little bit of watered down brown and cover that up. There's this little area where we see this distant trail between the trees. So I'm using that dark paint to slightly suggest that. And let's add a couple of dark tree trunks climbing up towards our yellow. Crisscross branches. You can even use your finger to blur out some of your marks. Yes, you can use fingers in watercolor painting. Totally fine. And coming over to the right side, darkening up the foreground here a little bit. Nothing too specific. All right, I need to mix up some more paint. That used up pretty quick. Whenever you work dark, you'll find your paint uses up fast. Okay, so now to create the suggestion of leaves on the ground, I want to think in terms of clusters almost, rather than individual leaves. So I'm using a swooshing motion of the brush to paint around several clusters. And of course, it's going to be more spread out and tiny the further away you get. So dry brush technique to scrape my brush across. And then If I want to, I can carve out a few little individual shapes. Really important not to make them uniform or all alike, same size, shape, all of that. Just like with your trees in the background, make it uneven, asymmetrical, no patterning at all. So you can see it's starting to look like the suggestion of fallen leaves on the ground. Just a couple of negative painted leaves, leaving the gold shining through. And I want to even darken up my corners a little bit more, creating a more vignetted look. This aspen tree over here, don't feel like I quite did it justice. So to help it look like an aspen, I'm going to add those unique little black spots that almost look like eyes on the aspen tree. Little stripes and spots. Anyone can paint a tree shape, but what makes it that kind of tree, a particular kind of tree? What gives it the character that it needs for someone to recognize it as an aspen tree? To me, it's these stripes and markings on the tree. Stripes and spots. They look like eyes. Don't overdo it, just a little suggestion of them. You can add some of those to the trunk on the other tree. And then step back from your design, and it's a good idea to just decide, how is the balance of my painting? Do I need to add any darks anywhere else? Is there anywhere that could use some lifting? And so far, I'm pretty happy with that. So let's let it dry all the way, and then we'll remove our masking fluid and see how we did. Once your painting is dry, you can remove your masking fluid. I prefer to use clean, dry fingers because it allows me to feel the areas that I need to remove the masking fluid still. Boy, that's fun to see how the white was so perfectly preserved. And the etcher paper handles masking fluid beautifully. We can also remove our tape, revealing our pretty borders. And the tape did great as well. No tearing. So there it is. One brush, 3 colors, gorgeous etcher paper. The glowiest autumn scene. This paper was wonderful. I can't wait to play more with it. The only thing I'm going to add, I think, here at the end are just a couple more little branches separating the white here. Just a tiny hint of color. Felt like that was too much of a distracting white gap. So I'm just going to fill that in with a little bit of yellow. But there we go. Again, if you want to see more projects like this, check out Watercolor Mastery. I hope to see you there. Thanks for painting along with me today. I'll see you in the next video.